Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with public policy in the great state of Texas. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and I am particularly excited for today's episode as we welcome John Hill to the program. John is days away from completing his service as the Interim General Secretary of the United Methodist General Board of Church and Society, an agency charged with leading the denomination's social witness around the world. It's a perfect time for this conversation as we move into a critical election season where the social witness of the church will be of the utmost importance, and faith leaders will be called to lead. But also, because the United Methodist Church recently concluded an historic general conference where they approved a complete revision of their social principles, their positions on community and policy issues, and after decades of strife, took historic votes to remove harmful LGBT policies from their book of discipline. I was a delegate at the conference and actually served on one of the Church and Society legislative committees, and y'all, what a process. I loved being able to work to come to consensus with people around the world on some important justice concerns. But more, I loved the holy conferencing and collaborative spirit in which the work was completed. My hope is that that spirit will be reflected in our public legislative bodies, but that will take us building relationships with candidates and elected representatives and supporting candidates who prioritize consensus and the common good. The first half of the conversation with John today will be a reflection from the United Methodist General Conference, but all of this will shape the work of Texas Impact and our members because Texas Impact as an organization develops our biennial legislative agenda based on the social statements of our member judicatories, a process that will begin with our board retreat in early September, so watch this space for more on that. But I have to say that I'm particularly excited for this conversation as a United Methodist because the work of the General Board of Church and Society, and more specifically the social principles, have shaped my life and my faith journey. They're a reminder that our faith calls us to action and provides a faithful guide to consider how faith calls us to interact with our community, public policy, and the political realm. And in this season, people of faith need that framing and that challenge as we consider the pressing public policy issues confronting our state and our nation. And for sure, we need the kick in the pants to make sure we're doing all we can to encourage our friends and congregations to engage this election season. And y'all are doing that. I've loved seeing your work and the engagement over the last few weeks and the last few months. And my hope for all of us today is that we'll consider what our faith calls us to in such a time as this and do all we can to engage our neighbors, to make phone calls, to write postcards, organize rides to the poll, and whatever else we can do to engage our communities. As always, Texas Impact has resources for you. Make sure you sign up and check out all of the resources at texasimpact.org, but especially those resources on the Texas Faith Votes page. We make it easy for you and your congregation to do this work together. If you have questions about any of it, please shoot me an email at scott@texasimpact.org. We're happy to help, but you're the ones with the local connections. So we look forward to supporting your efforts and cheering you on. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with John Hill. Joining us for today's conversation is the Interim General Secretary of the United Methodist General Board of Church and Society, John Hill, friend of the program, friend of Texas Impact. John, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me.
I guess it's a title you have for a few more days. I know life has been crazy for you over the last few months. I really do appreciate you taking the time today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. I am coming to you from Europe, so I'm 6 hours ahead from your, or 7 hours ahead for your recording time. But feeling good and excited about the transition, both for our organization and really for the United Methodist Church that's coming.
It is an exciting time for the United Methodist Church, and I'm sad you're on the way out when all of the exciting things are happening. But probably a way to capstone your remarkable career. Let's talk about the historic time we are in as United Methodist and as a church. We just had what I think many would consider an historic United Methodist General Conference. Before we jump into the specifics, what were your general reflections after leaving that 2-week gathering?
You know, I've been to, I think I counted them up, maybe 6 general conferences, including the special called session in 2019. And I think if you polled anyone there, they would say something akin to what I'm going to say, which was the tone and the spirit was just fundamentally different. Folks were excited folks were. I mean, there was some level of anxiety, but I felt like for the first time, folks were really excited about moving forward, about moving through some of the conversations that we have been stuck in for decades. And I think folks could see a way through that and to a brighter future, one where United Methodist could really, live out their faith in their communities across the worldwide connection. And so there was a different spirit, and honestly, it felt like there was not the possibility that there would not be success, right? I think we've
Right.
had so many general conferences that have ended either at a stalemate or kicking the can down the road or kicking it to the bishops to try and solve. And I think folks came together and realized that this is our chance to prove that this legislative body can do something. And they did it. And that was really exciting.
Yeah, as somebody who's been to a couple myself, I left previous conferences feeling like, and again, as somebody who works in the public policy realm, that it looked way too much like Washington, D.C., right, where there were factions. And this time, we've heard the word holy conferencing for years and years, and I always thought maybe it was aspirational, but this conference really did seem like there was holy conferencing going on. There were people trying to work together, trying to find outcomes that were mutually beneficial. It really was a good model for what democracy should look like, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is similar skepticism about whether other legislative bodies, be they in state houses or the U.S. Congress, can actually do anything. And I felt there were echoes of that within the dynamics within the United Methodist Church and this highest legislative body. And I think it proves that organizing, relationship building, conversations across divides pay off, that is how we find space for some common values, common ground, and a common way forward.
Let's talk about some of that work that did get done, because there was a lot. I know for many advocates and many folks that I'm friends with anyway, it was the conference was organized around what folks would call the 3 R's, which at the end of the day, all 3 ended up passing. But let's walk through those quickly. I believe all 3 of them would have nexus to public policy work here in Texas and throughout the country. But the first and the one that is most consequential to folks in the church and society realm is the historic approval of the revised social principles. And I know you had an enormous role in that, going back for years, if not maybe decades at this point. But talk to us about the work of what went into that revised social principles and why is it important?
Sure. Right. So that is the work of the social principles, right? Carrying out that work is entrusted to church and society. And it was really a 12-year journey for us as an organization, with tremendous staff support from so many former and current staff and board members to look at the social principles, which are our fundamental social teachings, right? Sort of the statements of how we imagine the world should be on issues of concern to humankind and the care of creation. And it was the first time that we actually sort of took a step back and said, hey, we've been editing these things since 1972. I personally have said this before, I personally sort of have an affection for this patchwork quilt of words that are the still current social principles that are, in the 2016 Book of Discipline. But if you read it, you can see language that was clearly echoes of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and today. And the fundamental question was, they were born out of a U.S. context, and the church is a fundamentally different church now. And even as successive general conferences have tried to make them less U.S. centric, it really needed kind of a wholesale, let's turn the page, start with the blank page. What do we want to say as a worldwide denomination? And so this 12-year process was both a listening time, a time of kind of discovery of what the social principles mean in different contexts. We held them all around the world. And then after 2016, a revision phase where we had writing teams, again, that were representative of our worldwide connection, came together to see what would statements that speak to across these different contexts of the church, what might these statements say? Our charge from General Conference was to find language that was theologically grounded, that was more succinct, and that spoke to and out of a worldwide connection. And so, it was a tremendous process. We had input from literally thousands upon thousands of United Methodists, and we're grateful that the General Conference received that and understood the work that went into it and the care in crafting that and the editing of those different statements and inputs, and passed it pretty much as we had submitted it, as the General Board of Church and Society had submitted it with one kind of clarifying language related to marriage, but that was the only change made.
Yeah, it is an incredible document, and certainly a ton of work went into it. I think this is one of those things where a lot of work went into a project, and now it's not supposed to stay on a shelf, right? What do you hope people will do with those revised social principles now that they've been approved?
Well, I hope that folks, and this has long been our hope for the social principles in general, is that they don't sit on a shelf and gather dust, that we actually live into them as United Methodists, we understand them, we preach and teach on them, that we proclaim them in halls of power. I think that with this new document, it really compels us to read them anew. They are different. The things aren't, and this is going to be an adjustment for many of us who are deeply familiar with the social principles. Some of the language that we always went to is in a different place. The numbers are going to be different, right? We had 7 sections, we're down to 5. And so the first thing is really for United Methodist and people who are interested to unpack them, to read them. It's a much more succinct document. It's designed for teaching and preaching. And so each section has a very clear theological grounding, has sort of a Wesleyan perspective at the beginning, and articulation of the challenges facing the different communities and the different sections of the social principles, and then what our vision as United Methodists might be, what we would like to see in the world. And so we have some resources already on our website, even though the social principles, these revised social principles don't take effect until January 1, 2025. But there's been such a demand for sort of tools to kind of learn about them that we have a suite of resources already on our website, mission and ministry cards for each of the sections. So I ask folks to go to umcjustice.org. You'll find them very clearly on our homepage. And then once we get into 2025, we'll roll out additional resources for folks to give life to those social principles.
I love the social principles, and I love walking into churches where I see those social principles cards in the narthex or gathering space. So, folks, we've got our homework there. I led off with the social principles because they really do guide Texas Impact's work, and we have our board retreat coming up soon, and we'll certainly refer back to those. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the headlines coming out of General Conference for the wider audience would have been focused on the second R, which was removing anti-LGBT harmful language from the United Methodist Book of Discipline. That was years in the making, a big step. Any reflections on that piece?
Yeah, I think it's one of those where certainly we knew that would be the headline. That has been the focus of much of the disagreement within the church. In many ways, that is just the latest presenting issue of a power struggle that goes way back. And so I think folks understood that the root conflict within the church was not actually around issues of LGBTQ inclusion, but that was the space in which it was getting lived out. And so I think for us, doing the work of justice in the world, the United Methodist Church has actually had strong statements in support of civil rights for LGBTQ persons for a long time. But in that work, it is deeply challenging and sort of highlights what some people suspect to be hypocrisy within churches, that we are asking for one thing in civil society and holding ourselves to a different standard. Proclaiming that there should be protected rights recognized in civil society while protecting our right as the church to discriminate within the practices of ministry. So I think in some ways, reconciling that question really gives stronger witness to our work in the wider world. And my hope and expectation is that this will allow us as United Methodists to really expand and increase our witness wherever we are in the world, and stand up for the rights of all people.
Yeah, and it certainly has been lived out. I know since I have been home from Charlotte, it has certainly been noticeable in my local community that the church has made a statement, and so I'm grateful for the work of the conference on that, and it's having a positive impact on local churches. I know. And finally, not to get too far into the weeds for folks who are not United Methodists, but the third R had to do with regionalization, which still needs to be ratified by United Methodist annual conferences throughout the world. But this would create regional structures around the world, provide more equity throughout the church. I wonder if you can just say a few words about why this is important from a justice perspective.
Sure. I think part of similar to what I said about the social principles, understanding that even as we as a church tried to make them more globally resonant, that at their core, they were still a US-based document, US originated document. Similarly, the church, despite its efforts to sort of change some of the power dynamics between the US and the central conferences, those United Methodists outside of the US, the structures are still deeply embedded as US structures. And I think this is an effort to de-center the US from the decision-making for the global denomination, that it is a way in which it will allow United Methodists in different regions to make contextually appropriate decisions that bind them, but not others. And so there will be common values held across the church. The social principles, for example, will not be adaptable by the regions. That will be something that is held by the whole church. But then other practices of ministry would be adaptable to enable greater ministry in those contexts. And so I'm hopeful that this will be adopted and ratified by the annual conferences, and then we can kind of continue to live into this imagining, restructuring, reframing of the United Methodist Church.
Certainly an important conversation, and those votes will be taking place over the course of the next year, so we'll look forward to see what the final result of that is. John, I do want to move on to what United Methodists and other people of faith can and should be doing in their local communities as we move into election season. But before we do that, any other general conference reflections before we move on?
No, it was one of those where folks were so excited, and then I think after catching our breath, we realized the work is just beginning. So right. There is a lot. I mean, for us, updating all of our documents, in addition to the social principles, lots of resolutions that were adopted. So great, strong language to support advocacy across our connection. And so looking forward to getting those resources out to United Methodists and continuing the work.
I think y'all's work in the office definitely picked up, but also all of our work is picking up as we move into an important election season. John, you've worked in D.C. for most of your career, in Europe at the moment, but talk to us about why faithful engagement in local communities is important to the advocacy work that folks at Church and Society do, that folks at Texas Impact do, that advocates who are in the building are doing. Why is that local engagement important to your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I've worked in DC for 30 years, and from different vantage points. I worked in Congress, worked in lobby consulting business, and then from the faith perspective at Church and Society for 22 of those years. And it's sort of amazing to look back and see the progress that has been made, that we still are continuing to make. And I don't know that we ever knew when it was going to happen, right? It feels like those the problems, challenges often seem really intractable until they are solved, until there's movement. And it really is important to have, right? So part of it is that the faith community, local communities, individuals telling their story, creating that narrative, getting that in front of decision makers, right? In casual settings and formal settings, that is really important, and then builds this sort of infrastructure for us so that when an opportunity actually arises or a situation happens that compels response, we're prepared for that. We've done the work, we've done the sort of organizational building of that capacity and that power through the local context to bring to that struggle. And so whether that was the Affordable Care Act or more recently Inflation Reduction Act or protecting the Affordable Care Act, the ebbs and flows of attention and sort of the politics of DC are really hard to predict. And so that's why the kind of faithful, steady work, sometimes when it feels sort of like maybe the least opportune moment, like building that in just consistently is so critical. And that's what I love about Texas Impact. What we aspire to at Church and Society is just a constant kind of building of, and kind of like with exercise, right? Like doing these sort of building of the muscles so that when the moment arises, we have that capacity to engage.
I love that. I wonder if you have a challenge or a message to local churches about the importance of civic engagement work, especially as we move into election season. I know, getting out ahead of y'all, I think you have an event coming up next week that's talking about exactly that. But why is it important? What do you hope congregations would do?
Yeah, so we have some resources. Again, we have a civic engagement toolkit that really outlines the kind of both a call for faithful engagement in voting, civic engagement in electoral work, as well as the kind of do's and don'ts, right? It's really important that we as 501c3, we as the faith community don't cross that line into sort of partisan politics, but that we do show up and let all folks who are seeking our votes know what our views are. I mean, I think about just the narrative right now in this moment around immigration, which is so difficult and seems to have been, in some ways, sort of pushed to the side by both major U.S. political parties, and how we as people of faith need to step into that void and make sure that folks are not just pursuing policies, but talking about challenges of immigration in ways that are humane and uphold the dignity of all people. So yeah, I think that there are lots of ways that local churches can educate folks, have those conversations around the issues that are important. And, there's so much attention given to the sort of big ticket races in the US, but so many decisions, and we've seen this in the last 5 years, certainly play out really in dramatic ways. So many decisions are made at local school boards, at, county elections. And so it's not just the ones that are getting all the national attention and that dominate the news headlines, but making sure that you have a deep understanding of who the folks are asking for your vote at the local level, and that most times, you'll have a much better chance of having individual conversations with those folks in much more casual settings. And so being able to be prepared to kind of articulate what is important to you, what's important to you and your family or your church community.
Yeah, let me follow up on that a little bit. Also, I love that you highlighted local races. I mean, we've been talking a lot about school boards here in Texas recently, and you can have a much bigger impact in those local races. But John, I've been thinking a lot about this since the summer, and I can't shake it. I had 3 United Methodist leadership students at a camp that I was attending, and spent the week getting to know them and heard their stories about all the things that they cared about. The environment, LGBT rights, all of these different issues. And about halfway through the week, they told me they didn't plan on voting because they didn't think that their vote mattered. Right. And so
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of people like that sitting in pews, sitting in United Methodist congregations, sitting in all of our member denominations pews. Clearly, voter turnout is not 100% in any of these places.
Right.
What would you say to faith leaders, recognizing that there are a lot of people who care about issues that aren't taking the time? What's our role in that?
That's hard. I think, that's one of the challenges I have from living in Washington for 30 years, because it is really difficult for me to imagine not being engaged in the act of voting, and having seen the dramatic differences that happen when based on the outcomes of elections, right? But based on who gets on the Supreme Court, who's nominated by the president onto the Supreme Court, based on, and it, someone, again, sort of enmeshed in the DC world, knowing the kind of quieter work that happens in agencies that is sometimes transformative for folks, whether that's around nutrition, whether that's around science standards, whether that's on climate work, that may not get the headlines, but that makes dramatic differences. And so, I mean, I get being somewhat disillusioned, but at the end of the day, I don't understand abdicating what I think is your responsibility as a citizen, but also deciding that it's not important, or somehow that there isn't a difference between the two candidates. And there are. That is not to say that both parties, when we're talking about national parties, that both parties can be wrong on things, right? I mean, I think we see bipartisan cooperation on horrible things all the time, whether that's in wars, whether that's in sort of pandering within the tax code to businesses. I think that happens all the time, but there are still, my feeling is that there are still qualitative differences in things that I care deeply about that compel me to engage. And then once you're engaged, hold those folks accountable.
Yeah, and I think the important work of the General Board of Church and Society and agencies like y'all's is connecting faith to that activism, right? That this is an act of faith. And so I appreciate y'all's work on that end. Speaking of, you have spent years as a leader in the faith-based advocacy community in DC and beyond. I wonder if you have any thoughts you want to leave with faith-based advocates as you transition out of this role.
Oh, God. I mean, gosh, that is a really difficult question in some ways, because it feels like an ending that I'm not quite sure I'm willing to acknowledge. I think one thing I would say is that, maybe I'll just speak kind of personally, the ways in which at times when things are exhausting, and that happens to all of us, I know, whatever our position is, whatever our role is, it is those relationships and stories and connections to others that has always sustained me and inspired me. And as much as those of us who work at kind of the national level or at the state level are seen as quote unquote leaders, I can say for sure that my inspiration and my whatever I've been able to do or what has guided me has been the inspiration of folks in the local settings who tell their story, who show up faithfully, who have been doing this work for a lot longer than 30 years I've been doing it. And so just remember to hold each other in that and support each other in that. And I think that's how we get through the darker, more trying times. I don't have a good pep talk other than to say that, my experience has been at every step of the way when I feel like there's, when I'm tired or when I am a little disillusioned, there is someone who comes alongside and picks me up and either carries the work forward or reminds me of the importance of the work.
Well, John, you have certainly carried the work forward for many years. And I know as a United Methodist myself, I always have great hope knowing that the Board of Church and Society is fighting the good fight, doing the good work in DC. And you have certainly been a leader in that for years and years and years. And on behalf of United Methodists everywhere, I am grateful for you and your ministry and your leadership. And we have a lot of folks who are going to continue that work forward, standing on your shoulders. I know you're not done. You've got a lot you still have to offer. So this isn't like goodbye or anything. But I do want to give you a chance here at the end to offer any closing thoughts or shameless plugs that you want to leave folks with.
Yeah, I mean, it is. You said it at the beginning. It's sort of an interesting time to be transitioning out of a role. When I was at General Conference, I was thinking, it's kind of, it makes sense, right? There has been this work, and to be able to leave at a time when there feels like there's some closure, some at least turning the page to a new chapter. But I don't know that I'm jealous, but I am excited for folks who are continuing this work in that new chapter, because there is, it feels so fresh and sort of alive with possibilities. And you named it in your local setting. I see that in my local church, just this widespread, like being able to exhale, breathe, smile, and then like get to the work. And that we have these new documents that can empower and inspire us, that we have new leadership. So I am excited to see what this next chapter of United Methodism is. I am someone who believes deeply that sort of brighter days are definitely ahead, and the church is going to look different, but I think it's going to look different in just amazing new ways.
All right, John, I really do appreciate your decades of ministry and leadership, and really grateful that you're willing to take the time with us today on one of your last days. So thanks again for everything. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Scott.
I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with John, and I hope we're all considering ways we can engage our congregation and community in this important work, especially during this season. Y'all, we have real work that needs to be done to create a better and more just Texas, and my hope is that this podcast and this conversation is a tool for you, and I can't wait to hear about your next steps. Our faith traditions call us to engage and work for justice and equity for all people, to care for our neighbors and communities. Now is the moment to act. If not now, when? As always, Texas Impact has tools for you. I especially hope everyone is using the Texas Faith Votes resources. You can find those and so much more at texasimpact.org. While you're there, I hope you'll take a moment to sign up to be a member of Texas Impact. Your membership supports this podcast and all of the work to engage Texans of faith to advocate for a more just and equitable Texas. If you have questions about any of it, please reach out. You can reach me at scott@texasimpact.org. And with that, I think it's time to close out this episode. So remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Attinen, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.